Episode 5, The Hollow Man's Grasp. The Hollow Man moved with an unnatural grace, gliding toward the clearing with long, fluid strides. Its body, a constantly shifting mass of shadows, seemed to absorb the light from their torches, making the air around it grow colder, darker. The whispers grew louder, echoing in Evelyn's mind, relentless and invasive. The air around her felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself had come alive, to swallow them whole. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest, every fiber of her being screamed for her to run, to flee from this nightmare, but her feet were rooted to the spot, frozen by the Hollow Man's sheer presence. She could feel the darkness clawing at the edges of her vision, threatening to pull her under. Lucas stood beside her, gripping his torch tightly, his face pale but determined. Father Michael, his cross held high, muttered prayers under his breath, though his voice trembled with fear. "We have to move," Father Michael shouted, breaking the spell of terror that had gripped them. "The altar, now." Evelyn shook herself from her paralysis, her instincts kicking in. She rushed toward the center of the clearing where the ancient altar stood, its surface etched with strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. The stone felt cold and wrong, like something that had been touched by evil for centuries. She knew this was the heart of the curse, the source of the darkness that had plagued Ashcroft for generations. Lucas was by her side instantly, his eyes flicking nervously between the altar and the Hollow Man, which was closing in on them. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice strained with fear. "Fire," Father Michael said, his voice firm, despite the terror that laced his words. "We burn it. The altar is tied to the curse, and only fire can sever its connection to the shadows." Without hesitation, Lucas pulled out the bundle of dry kindling they had brought, hastily piling it around the base of the stone altar. Evelyn lit a match, her hands trembling as the small flame danced to life. She dropped it onto the kindling, and within moments, flames licked up the altar's sides, casting flickering shadows across the clearing. But the Hollow Man didn't stop. It moved closer, its form shifting and writhing like a mass of living shadows. Its presence was suffocating, a cold, malevolent force that pressed down on them from all sides. The shadows that surrounded it seemed to pulse, growing thicker, more tangible, as if they were an extension of its will. Evelyn could feel the weight of its gaze, even though the creature had no discernible eyes. It was watching her, studying her, as though it was waiting for the right moment to strike. "Father Michael," she shouted, panic rising in her throat. "It's still coming." The priest turned, his face ashen but resolute. He raised his cross and stepped forward, his voice rising in a commanding prayer. "In the name of God, I command you to leave this place." The Hollow Man halted, if only for a moment. The shadows around it recoiled slightly as if repelled by the power of the holy symbol. But the moment was fleeting. The creature let out a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a whisper, and the shadow surged forward again, more determined than ever. Father Michael's eyes widened in horror as he realized the cross was only delaying the inevitable. "It's too strong," he shouted, his voice cracking. "We need to destroy the altar, now." The flames around the altar were growing, but they weren't burning fast enough. The ancient stone seemed to resist the fire, the runes carved into its surface glowing brighter as if feeding on the dark energy that surrounded them. The Hollow Man was nearly upon them now, its shadowy form towering over the clearing, its presence oppressive and overwhelming. Lucas grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her back. "We need more fire," he shouted over the roar of the flames and the rising whispers of the shadows. "It's not enough." Evelyn's mind raced. There had to be something else, something more they could do. Her eyes scanned the clearing, desperate for a solution, when she spotted the small vial of holy water Father Michael had placed on the ground. "Lucas, the holy water," she shouted, pointing toward the vial. He hesitated for only a second before rushing toward it, snatching the vial from the ground. Father Michael was already beside the altar, muttering prayers as he sprinkled salt around its base, hoping to ward off the encroaching shadows. Lucas uncorked the vial and threw the holy water onto the flames. The effect was immediate. The flames roared to life, surging upward in a bright blaze that illuminated the entire clearing. The runes on the altar flared with a blinding light, and the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. For a moment, Evelyn felt a surge of hope. Maybe this would be enough. Maybe they could stop the Hollow Man. But then the ground beneath them trembled. A deep, rumbling sound filled the air, as if the earth itself was groaning in protest. The flames continued to burn, but the shadows didn't retreat. Instead, they grew more frenzied, swirling around the Hollow Man like a tornado of darkness. The creature let out a guttural hiss, and the shadows lunged forward with terrifying speed. Evelyn barely had time to react. The shadows swept toward her, cold and suffocating, like a wave of pure malice. She stumbled back, her torch flickering as the darkness closed in. Lucas was beside her, swinging his torch wildly, trying to keep the shadows at bay, but it wasn't enough. The Hollow Man was too strong. Father Michael was shouting something, his voice lost in the chaos, when the shadows reached him. One of the tendrils of darkness lashed out, wrapping around the priest's arm with terrifying speed. Father Michael screamed, the sound filled with agony, as the shadows coiled around him, pulling him toward the Hollow Man. Evelyn's heart lurched in her chest as she watched the priest struggle, his face contorted with pain. "Father!" Lucas shouted, rushing toward him, but the shadows were too fast. They engulfed Father Michael, pulling him into their depths, his screams echoing through the clearing. Evelyn felt a wave of despair wash over her as she watched the priest disappear into the darkness. The Hollow Man loomed over them now, its form towering and monstrous, its presence overwhelming. The shadows writhed and twisted around it, pulsating with malevolent energy. For a moment, it felt like all was lost. The altar was burning, but the shadows weren't retreating. The Hollow Man was too strong, too powerful. Evelyn's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to think of something, anything, that could stop it. But then she remembered Father Michael's words, fire and blood. Her breath caught in her throat. The curse was tied to the altar, and only a sacrifice, blood, could sever the connection. But whose blood? Father Michael had said it had to be the blood of someone tied to Ashcroft. Someone who belonged here. Her mind reeled. Was that the only way? Was she considering? No. Lucas's voice cut through her thoughts. He grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with fear. "We'll find another way. We have to." But Evelyn knew. Deep down, she knew what had to be done. Her father had disappeared because of this curse. The shadows had taken him, just like they had taken Father Michael, and countless others before them. She couldn't let it continue. She couldn't let the Hollow Man win. Tears stung her eyes as she pulled away from Lucas, her heart breaking with the weight of her decision. "There's no other way," she whispered, her voice trembling. Lucas shook his head, his grip tightening on her arm. "No, Evelyn, don't." But she was already moving. With a final glance at Lucas, she stepped toward the altar, her hands trembling as she raised the knife Father Michael had brought. The flames roared around her, the heat intense, but it was the cold gaze of the Hollow Man that sent chills down her spine. The shadows pulsed, reacting to her movements as if they knew what she was about to do. "Evelyn, please!" Lucas shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. "You don't have to do this." But she did. She had to. With one final, shuddering breath, Evelyn pressed the blade to her palm, the cold metal biting into her skin. Blood welled up, dark and thick, and as it dripped onto the altar, the runes flared with an intense, blinding light. The ground beneath her trembled again, but this time, the shadows recoiled, pulling back from the altar as if burned by the blood. The Hollow Man let out a screech, a sound so inhuman it made Evelyn's blood run cold. The creature writhed, its form unraveling as the light from the altar grew brighter and brighter, engulfing the entire clearing. Evelyn felt herself being pulled into the light, the world spinning around her. The last thing she heard was Lucas calling her name, his voice filled with anguish. And then, everything went black. End of episode 5.